So the Mexican-American War was a military disaster for Mexico. So the Mexico City will fall towards the end of the war, and Mexico has very little choice but to agree to U.S. terms. So in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the following terms are agreed upon. First of all, Mexico would recognize the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. Also, that the U.S. would take possession of the former Mexican provinces of California and New Mexico. So, this lovely chunk of land, all these natural resources. This would be called the Mexican Cession. For these territories, the U.S. would pay about $15 million and also assume the claims of American citizens against Mexico. In the Senate, a lot of the Whigs opposed the treaty because they saw the war as kind of an immoral effort to expand slavery. A few Southern Democrats disliked the treaty for opposite reasons. As expansionists, they wanted the U.S. to take all of Mexico, so not just the Mexican cession. Nevertheless, the treaty was finally ratified in the Senate by that required two-thirds vote. And U.S. entry into a war with Mexico provoked a lot of controversy. So right in the beginning of the war in 1846, a man named David Wilmot, who's a congressman from Pennsylvania, proposed an appropriations bill that would be amended to eventually forbid slavery in any of the new territories acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso was passed by the House twice, but it was defeated in the Senate. So these increasing tensions between the North and the South to acquire territories from Mexico sort of led inevitably to the American Civil War, because without question the acquisition of these vast western lands really renewed that sectional debate over the extension of slavery. A lot of Northerners viewed the war with Mexico as part of that Southern plot to extend slave power. A lot of historians see the Wilmot Proviso as the first round in an escalating political conflict that would ultimately lead to civil war. So many Southerners were dissatisfied with the territorial gains from the Mexican War. They really hoped to acquire new territories, especially in areas of Latin America, because in Latin America you've got all these plantations that were worked by slaves, so they were thought to be economically feasible. Probably the most tempting and eagerly sought possibility in the eyes of Southern expansionists was the acquisition of Cuba. So President Polk actually offered to purchase Cuba from Spain for about $100 million, but Spain refused to sell that last major remnant of its once glorious empire. A lot of Southern adventurers led small expeditions to Cuba, kind of in an effort to take the island by force. These forays were easily defeated, so those who participated were usually executed by Spanish firing squads. So in 1852, Franklin Pierce was elected to the presidency, and he adopted that pro-Southern view. So he dispatched American diplomats to Belgium to secretly negotiate the purchase of Cuba from Spain. That was called the Ostend Manifesto. And that Ostend Manifesto that the diplomats drew up ended up leaked to the press in the United States. So it really provoked an angry reaction from a lot of the anti-slavery members of Congress. So that kind of forced President Pierce to sort of drop the whole thing. So another American ambition concerned building the canal through Central America. Wanting to kind of check each other from seizing the opportunity, Great Britain and the United States agreed to this Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which said that neither nation could attempt to take exclusive control of any future canal route in Central America. So the treaty kind of continued in force until the end of the century, and then there's a new treaty that'll be signed in 1901 that gave the United States a free hand to build a canal through Central America. And they will, but not through Nicaragua, through Panama. So, although he failed to acquire Cuba, President Pierce succeeded in adding a strip of land to the American Southwest for a railroad, and that's the Gadsden Purchase, purchased from Mexico in 1853 for $10 million. So the issue of slavery in the territories gained in the Mexican War became the focus of the sectional differences of the late 1840s. That Wilmot Proviso would have upset the Compromise of 1820 and that whole delicate balance of 15 free and 15 slave states. So the defeat of the Wilmot Proviso really only intensified sectional feelings. And so the issue of how to deal with these new Western territories will bring about all these different conflicting positions. Probably the first of those is the Free Soil movement. A lot of Northern Democrats and Whigs who supported the Wilmot Proviso also supported the idea that all blacks, slave and free, should be excluded from the Mexican cession. So in the North, anti-slavery forces and racists alike could now find common ground in their support for this free soil position. Unlike the abolitionists, who insisted on eliminating slavery everywhere, Free Soilers didn't demand the end of slavery. Instead, they sort of sought to keep the West a land of opportunity for whites, only for whites, so that the white majority wouldn't have to compete with the labor of slaves or with free blacks. So in 1848, Northerners favoring this approach to the territories organized the Free Soil Party, which the Free Soil Party eventually adopted this slogan, free soil, free labor, free men. And in addition to preventing the extension of slavery, the chief objective of this new party also advocated free homesteads or public land grants to small farmers and internal improvements. Most Southern whites really viewed these attempts to restrict the extension of slavery as a violation of their constitutional right. So they will conflict with the Free Soilers because they saw both the abolitionists and the Free Soilers as really intent on the ultimate destruction of slavery. A lot of more moderate Southerners favored extending the Missouri Compromise line westward to the Pacific and just permitting territories north of that line to be non-slave. One senator named Lewis Cass proposed the idea of popular sovereignty. This idea means that instead of Congress determining whether to allow slavery in a new Western territory or state, it meant that the voters in the territory or state would get to vote for whether or not to allow slavery. So in 1848, the Democrats nominated Cass, and they also adopted a platform pledging to popular sovereignty. The Whigs nominated General Zachary Taylor, who was a Mexican war hero. Taylor had never been involved in politics, and he took no position on slavery in the territories. The Free Soil Party nominated former President Martin Van Buren, and the Free Soil Party consisted of Whigs who opposed slavery. They were also called conscious Whigs, and anti-slavery Democrats. So the anti-slavery Democrats were also called barn burners because they sort of defected from the other Democrats who preferred slavery. So in 1849, there's a big gold rush, and then there's about 100,000 settlers who move into California, and that really created the need for law and order in the West. So in 1849, Californians drafted a constitution to make themselves a state, and in their constitution, they banned slavery. So even though President Taylor was a Southern slaveholder himself, he supported the immediate admission of both California and New Mexico as free states. At this time, however, the Mexican population of the New Mexico territory had really very little interest in applying for statehood. Taylor's plan sparked talk of secession among the radicals in the South. Some Southern extremists even met in Nashville in 1850 to discuss secession. But by this time, Henry Clay had proposed yet another compromise for solving the political crisis. You might remember that Clay drafted the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Clay's new compromise included admitting California as a free state, dividing the Mexican cession into two territories, Utah and New Mexico, and allow the settlers in those territories to decide the slavery issue by majority vote or by popular sovereignty. Clay's compromise also said to give the land in dispute between Texas and the New Mexico territory to the new territories in return for the federal government assuming Texas's debt of about $10 million. It also included banning the slave trade in the District of Columbia, but permit whites to hold slaves just like they had before. And it also included the adoption of a new fugitive slave law that he said should be rigorously enforced. So in the ensuing Senate debate over the compromise proposal, the three congressional giants of the age, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun, delivered the last great speeches of their lives. Webster courageously argued for compromise. Calhoun argued against compromise and insisted that the South should be given equal rights in the acquired territory. A lot of the Northern opposition to the compromise came from a very young anti-slavery lawmaker, Senator William H. Seward. Seward argued that there was a higher law than the Constitution, and the opponents, like Seward, managed to prevail until the sudden death in 1850 of President Taylor. Taylor had opposed Clay's plan, so when he dies, succeeding him was the strong supporter of the compromise, Vice President Millard Fillmore, who in my mind looks exactly like Alec Baldwin. Isn't that creepy and weird? Stephen A. Douglas, who was the politically astute young senator from Illinois, would sort of engineer different coalitions to pass each part of the compromise separately until President Fillmore was ready to sign all these bills into law. So the passage of the Compromise of 1850 brought time for the nation. Because California was admitted as a free state, the compromise added to the North's political power, and the political debate deepened the commitment of many Northerners to saving the Union from secession. On the other hand, parts of the compromise became sources of controversy, especially the new fugitive slave law and the provision for popular sovereignty. So it was the passage of a strict fugitive slave law that persuaded many Southerners to accept the loss of California to the abolitionists and the Free Soilers. The fugitive slave law was very difficult to enforce, but it's incredibly harsh. The law's chief purpose was to track down runaway slaves who had escaped to a northern state, then capture them, then return them to their southern owners. The law placed fugitive slave cases under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. So special U.S. commissioners were then authorized to issue warrants for the arrest of fugitives, and any captured person who claimed to be a free black and not a runaway slave, which was a common occurrence, was denied the right of trial by jury. So citizens who attempted to hide a runaway or obstruct enforcement of the law were then subject to heavy penalties. So the Underground Railroad helped escaped slaves reach freedom in the North or in Canada. And it was neither well organized nor dominated by white abolitionists, as it is sometimes believed. Both Northern free blacks and courageous ex-slaves led other blacks to freedom. Escaped slave Harriet Tubman made at least 19 trips into the South, and she helped some 300 slaves escape. Free blacks in the North and abolitionists also organized vigilance committees to protect those fugitive slaves from slave catchers. So once the Civil War broke out, black leaders continued to take an active role